All right, welcome back. We are on lecture 7. This is our final official lecture of the class, and we're going to finish with talking about protecting your business ventures. And again, the reason we sequence it this way is we start by building a foundation of what is an entrepreneur, who are entrepreneurs, how do we become an entrepreneur. We talked about idea validation. We talked about types of entrepreneurs, types of business models we can utilize. We've talked about creating the right opportunities through opportunity recognition and idea generation, and then even validating those ideas to the point now where we've gone through a lot of that business building practice and activity. And now we want to talk about maybe some more of the specific logistics. So we've got a business, we've got an idea, we want to pursue it, we want to run with it. What do we do to actually protect it from a legal standpoint? Because this is always a question that students ask every semester when they're getting started with their business. Should I set up an LLC? Should I have a corporation? How do I protect myself? And this lecture will go through your options available when you're getting started in your business, when you're putting together the paperwork and the entities and the bank accounts and all those things. This lecture will help lay a foundation for what you need to know in terms of protecting yourself moving forward. So we're going to jump in there. We're going to do an activity or two throughout the lecture where I'll have you pause the video and answer questions. But again, if you have questions as we move along, or if you finish the lecture and you've got questions about any of the entities or things we've talked about, please let me know, and I'll be happy to respond to those questions. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so why do we care about protecting our businesses, our ventures from a legal standpoint, or why does it matter how we set them up? Well, let's go through a few of these right now. The decision you make related to protecting your venture, to setting up your business the right way, can affect several things. Access to capital, legal liability that you might be responsible for should anything bad happen and people come after you from a legal standpoint. Expanding to new investors, it can affect how you can get new investors or how many investors you can get. And then the tax rules, obviously, there's different tax rules with different entities, and you have to know what your current situation looks like so you can make the best decision possible when setting things up that way. So these are some things we're going to address as we talk about the different types of entities, different ways you can set up your business. And then once we finish that entity discussion, we'll discuss intellectual property, things like patents and copyrights, etc. And we'll discuss why those things are important to a new business and why they might be helpful to you in the future. Okay, so there are 4 main business structures we're going to talk about. These are the most popular and the most prevalent today when entrepreneurs are starting new businesses. So we'll go through all of those, and then we'll also talk about some variations amongst those different business structures. First one is the sole proprietorship, which again, we'll cover all these. We have partnerships, corporations, and limited liability companies, or LLCs for short. Now, there is some variation, like limited versus general partners, limited liability companies. There's some variation to those. They have now in most states something called series LLCs that you can set up as well. And then there's also subchapter S corporation, which is it's actually a designation you can make for certain entities. And so these are things we're going to discuss as we break down the attributes of each one of these business structures. And we'll discuss pros and cons for each and what might fit best with your particular situation. Okay, so we're going to start first with proprietorships. What is a proprietorship? Essentially what a proprietorship is let's pretend I want to go and open up an ice cream stand today, and I just decide, hey, I'm going to go to Home Depot, I'm going to buy my materials, I'm going to build a little stand, and I'm going to sit up on the side of the road, and I'm going to sell my ice cream. I start selling, I start making money, I put my money into my personal bank account, I try to keep track of what expenses I have for the business, but mainly it's just me getting started and doing a business. I don't worry about formal entity structure like through the state or anything else like that. I just go and set up a business and run it, and I call it my business even though it's really intermingled with a lot of my personal things like a personal bank account, for example. So that's really what a proprietorship is. There's really no formal way of setting up a proprietorship. It's just you saying, hey, I'm starting a business, here we go. and you don't take any other formal steps in terms of setting it up. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of having a proprietorship? Well, some of the advantages are, like you probably could tell from my explanation, it's very cheap and easy and quick to set up, right? There's really no setup. You just go and start your business. There's no agency problems. And before we get too deep in agency problems, I just want to give you maybe a brief definition of what an agency problem means, what that is. And essentially what I mean when I say agency problems is that in a business, there are times when a business owner will employ or bring other people on to act on behalf of the business or work for the business in some way, shape, or form. When that happens, and those people are acting on behalf of the business, they can sometimes make poor decisions that will negatively impact the business or the business owners. And that's what we like to call a principal-agent relationship. And so the owner is the principal, the agent is the person acting on behalf of the business, even though they're not the owner of the business or the one that may be liable for the business's actions. And so that's this idea of agency issues, agency problems. And when you're a sole proprietorship, it's just you doing it on your own. So there's really not going to be any agency problems in general. Okay. And then you tax at a personal rate of the owner, because really a proprietorship, again, there's no formal setting up of an entity. And so you're still going to be taxed any money you're making. You're still going to be taxed at your personal tax rate. And so that's important to understand too, if you're going to go this route and just, start selling, start running your business. Some of the disadvantages of the sole proprietorship, it does mean that you have unlimited liability as an owner. There's no way to protect yourself from liability because, again, there's no official legal structure or entity that's been set up. So if something bad happens to one of your customers because of your product or the thing that you sold them, you're going to be on the hook personally, which means that they can come and get your house, they can come and get your personal bank account, they can come and get all of your personal stuff because there's no separation between you personally and the business you're actually running. Okay. Limited funding because you really can't bring on investors with a proprietorship because there's no structure to it. And it's really up to you to be able to provide the funds and the money you need to continue to operate and grow the business. And then the finite life, obviously, right? There's no partner, there's no membership, there's no ownership beyond me just running my business. And so when I die, the business dies. There's no way to pass that on, okay? And that goes with the last line there, that it is very difficult to transfer ownership. So if there's a time where I said, hey, I want to sell my business, well, what am I really selling? Because I don't have a structure or anything. I mean, maybe I'm making money selling my ice cream, but how do I transfer that along? Maybe they pay for my ice cream stand, maybe they don't. It's just hard. It's hard to make those distinguishments when you don't understand what the structure is because there was no structure set up in the first place. And so all these things can be difficult when you're running a proprietorship. Okay. So that's a proprietorship or a sole proprietorship. And those are kind of advantages, disadvantages. We're going to move on now to partnerships, and we'll talk about partnerships in general and then some of the variations of partnerships that can arise. Okay, first and foremost is with partnerships, we need to understand that there's a general partnership and then there's also a limited partnership. Those are two different types of partnerships, okay? Now, a few notes about general partnerships first is that, or partnerships in general, really, for the most part, they are a bit more costly to start up because you have to usually put together some sort of formal contract that's going to explain the rights that all the partners have, okay? There can be agency problems, but usually those are small because the partners are usually acting together when operating the business versus like hiring people on or bringing on agents to help run or speak or act on behalf of the company. As far as taxes go, again, tax at the partner's personal tax rate. So if I'm a partner with my wife, for example, that's not a good example because we could be filing jointly married. So let's say I'm a partner with a friend of mine and we both have different personal tax rates. We're going to be taxed at our personal tax rates as it relates to the money that the partnership makes. Okay, so there's really no tax advantage to it. Just like a proprietorship, you're going to be taxed at your personal rate. Okay, so that's kind of an introduction to partnerships in general, and then we'll start to talk about some of the downsides in the next slide, and then we'll talk about limited partnerships and how those vary from a general partnership. Okay, so what are some of the downsides of running a business as a partnership? Well, unlimited liability, that's a big issue. Now, when I say unlimited liability, usually I'm specifically talking about general partners or a general partnership. Because you'll see when we talk about limited partnerships, there is some liability protection or at least liability limitation that can happen. And so for general partners, or if you set up a general partnership, there's unlimited liability, which again, just like a proprietorship, you're going to be on the hook for any bad things that happen to customers, and they can come after you and your personal assets and the things that you own to be compensated for any damage that they've incurred. Okay. Legal action is directed towards the group, not the individual partners. And the reason that's a downside is because let's say a partner does something bad that injures or hurts somebody, and that injured person comes and sues the partnership, you can also be on the hook, not just your partner. And so you can be on the hook for something your partner did, and maybe they hurt somebody or damaged something in some way, and that person coming to recoup their damages from the partnership can also go after you, which is not good. And then the partnerships are finite usually because there's, let's say, for example, there's two partners. If one of us dies, the other one could take over, but really there's no transfer of ownership unless there's specific contracts in place that help delineate what kind of ownership, what that ownership looks like, and also helps us, allows us to transfer ownership in the future should we want to. But usually a partner or partners want to have some sort of control over you passing your ownership on, and so usually there's limitations to that. And then it's difficult to raise additional money, additional equity, because again, you really can't bring investors into a partnership, at least a general partnership like this, and so it makes it more difficult. Now you'll see in the limited partnership, there is the ability to bring in quote unquote investors or limited partners that can really just act as money resources, and those people are not generally actively engaged in the business, which we'll talk about. So there's some downsides of the partnership and the general partnership specifically, and you'll see now when we jump in the limited partnership side how it's a little different and how you can get a little more benefit in a limited partnership setting, especially if we're talking about liability. Okay, so a limited partnership. How is this different than a general partnership? Again, in a general partnership, all the general partners are going to be unlimited. They're going to have unlimited liability. They really can't bring on investors because they're all general partners in the partnership itself. Now, in a limited partnership, you can actually shield some partners from legal liability. Okay, and the way that works is you have one or more general partners inside of this partnership, and one or more limited partners. Now, what's a limited partner? A limited partner is really a person that can come in and say, hey, I want to be a part of the business or invest in the business, but I don't want to be actively engaged in the day-to-day operation of the business. So let's say I'm running my ice cream shop with my best friend, and we want to go find an investor so we can open up a second ice cream shop. I could go find the investor and bring that person in as a limited partner, so that they're not making day-to-day decisions with the operation of the business, but they could give us money and then also benefit by being paid out from the money we make as part of our business, as part of our partnership. Okay. Now, the limited partners in that setting only have liability up to the amount they have invested in the partnership. So if a limited partner I just mentioned as an example came in and invested $10,000 into our partnership, then that limited partner could only be liable up to that $10,000 mark that they've invested in the business. So if for some reason we made a bad batch of ice cream and we got somebody really, really sick and they incurred $100,000 in hospital bills and they came and sued the partnership trying to be made whole for that, then what would happen is they could come after all of us, both general partners and limited partners, but the limited partner's liability could only be up to that $10,000 amount that they've invested in the business, and which means me and best friend partner would be liable for the remaining $90,000 in hospital bills that customer is trying to recoup. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, again, reach out to me, ask questions. The trade-off is that they're not allowed to make business decisions like I mentioned before. So if I come in as a limited partner, I can invest, and it's really just an investment. It's not an opportunity for me to hands-on grow a business. It's an opportunity for me to invest my money and then hopefully get a good return on it in the future. Okay, so that's a few notes about limited partnerships and how they're different than general partnerships. Because again, Limited partnerships limit their liability to the extent they've invested. They can't make day-to-day business decisions. And a general partner, on the other hand, is going to have unlimited liability. They make business decisions, and all the partners are equally liable to each other when it's only general partners, because they all have unlimited liability, even if one of the other partners was the one that caused the wrong or did the wrong to a customer. Okay. So general partnerships versus limited partnerships all encompass inside of this partnership bubble as far as one of the business entity structures that you can set up when running your business. Now, for the most part, partnerships aren't used nearly as often as corporations and LLCs, but there are occasions when people still utilize this kind of structure for whatever reason. So we'll talk more about corporations, LLCs, and then we'll kind of compare these. Okay, let's talk about corporations. I put this little graphic up on the slide because I think it's important for us to recognize what kind of companies out there are big, large corporations. And so you see things on there like Procter and Gamble and Johnson and Johnson and Bridgestone and Colgate and Shell and Citibank and all these big names we hear. Those are all very large corporations. Now we know a corporation is typically made up of shareholders, right? And shareholders can own percentages of the company through holding shares of that company, okay? And that's really how they're structured. So let's go through some of the advantages and disadvantages, and we'll discuss some other specifics related to corporations, especially as it relates to tax and other issues that you can face when setting up corporations. So some of the advantages we have with a corporation: you can have an unlimited number of owners and investors. And why is that? How is that? Well, you can continue to offer shares for people to buy. Okay, and when you buy a share, you become an owner or an investor in that company, in that corporation. So when we go and jump on the stock exchange and we go and buy, 10 shares of Apple, we've now become technically an owner or an investor in Apple, and we're relying on Apple to run the business in a sound way so that we can get a return on the investment we've made in Apple. Okay, and then unlimited life of the organization. So how is there an unlimited life as compared to a partnership or a proprietorship? Corporations have an unlimited life because how is the ownership passed along? Through stocks, right? Through shares. And that means even when I die, my stocks, my shares can be passed to family members or friends, or can be sold on the market, whatever it might be, but those shares will continue to exist. They don't just end when I die. They can continue to be passed on, which means the corporation can have unlimited life or infinite life moving forward. And then there is limited liability to the value of the capital you invest in a corporation, kind of like a limited partner. And so when I go and invest in a corporation, for example, my liability can be limited according to the amount of money I've invested in that corporation. Now, if you're a stockholder and you're buying shares, that are publicly traded on the stock exchange, and let's say the corporation does something bad and injures somebody or hurts somebody, now are you going to be on the hook liability-wise as far as paying the harmed or the damaged person? Probably not. It's going to be the corporation internally that handles that. But just know that there are some instances or occasions where liability can be enforced, especially if you're the creator of the corporation, you're setting up the business or running it privately, for example. But there is limitations as far as the amount of capital you ultimately invested in the corporation itself. Okay, some disadvantages of the corporation. Usually a lot more expensive to set up than any of the other entities we've talked about, and more expensive than setting up an LLC as well. And the big issue is that earnings are taxed twice. Okay, now what do I mean when I say earnings are taxed twice? You're taxed once at a corporate level with the money that's made inside of a corporation, and then dividends are taxed at a personal tax level. So what do I mean when I say dividends versus the corporate level? So let's say I set up a corporation, I'm running the business, and I'm paying myself a salary in that business. Okay, so I'm paying myself $100,000 in salary. I'm going to be taxed at a corporate level, perhaps, or depending on how it's structured, there's a corporate level tax. And then if I'm paid dividends, or maybe there's bonuses, you could call it whatever you want, paid at the end of the year because we've exceeded, profit numbers, or we have extra money to be dispersed to the owners, that could be taxed at a personal tax level when dividends are paid out. And again, There's obviously lots of variation to this, and I don't claim to be a tax professional by any means, but I'm just trying to introduce some of these topics related to entity structure so that you become familiar with some of the things to consider when you set them up. So those are advantages and disadvantages of corporations. We're going to talk on the next slide specifically about the C Corp, which is the most common corporation that's set up when we set up corporations, and what that entails, what attributes it has. Okay, so a C corporation, kind of like I described in the last slide with shareholders and executive positions and all those things inside of a corporation, those are typically not great options for small business owners because, again, they're more costly to set up, more difficult to manage and maintain over time, greater requirements typically, depending on what state you live in. And they're often oversold to new businesses, saying, hey, you've got to start a corporation in Nevada or Delaware because there's tax benefit to setting up a C Corp in those states, for example. And so it's not always good for the new business owner or somebody just starting out because of the complexity, the cost, and there's really oftentimes not enough benefit to setting up the corporation unless you start to become large enough or you're already a big company and you're looking to go public and you want to convert to a corporation. Those are things that people will do because of the advantages associated with that. And like I said, the double taxation is rough. It's difficult and it's a mess to pull profit out and can be much more complicated from a tax perspective when running your business through the corporation setting. So those are some things you need to know about a C Corp. And on our next slide, we're actually going to talk about a designation you can make with a corporation, and you can actually make this designation with an LLC as well, and what that means in terms of the way you treat the business as far as taxes go. Okay, so let's talk about the S corporation designation, because it's really not a type of a corporation. It's really more of a designation that you can make for a corporation or for an LLC even, as it relates to the way you're taxed, okay? So in this setting, they're still going to have limited liability. Income is only taxed at the personal level, but when I say that, I'm going to expand on that just a little bit. But hold that in your mind for a moment, and we'll talk a little bit more about it as we move along here. So now, when you make an S corporation designation, one of the downsides to it is that you're going to be limited to no more than 75 shareholders, okay? And none of those shareholders can be a corporation. Those are just the rules they set in place. Now, the reason they do that is because there is some tax advantage to the S corporation designation. And so they don't want you to be able to bring in unlimited amounts of shareholders because that tax advantage may be expanded to a huge degree, which government may not like, right? It does make it more difficult to raise additional capital when your shareholder number is limited. And there is still that higher startup cost, even more than a regular corporation when setting up the S Corp designation, just because some of the work and changes that have to be made to indicate that status, okay? The S Corporation designation is really good for operational businesses, sales and service businesses, just because of the nature of the money that they make and being able to pay yourself a salary and then pay yourself dividends at a different tax rate. Because like you see there at the bottom of the slide, this is really a great way to save on self-employment tax and start a salary method. Now, again, I don't want to get too far into the weeds as far as the details behind all of this. I just want to simply introduce you to this idea of making a designation. And so when I say an S Corp designation, really the advantage of it is that you can save on self-employment tax. Now, how do you do that? Well, if I set up a corporation or an LLC and I elect to be taxed as an S Corp, I can pay myself a salary, a salary that looks normal, average compared to other people in that same industry or that same space. And then any money made beyond that salary amount can be paid as a dividend, and we can actually tax those two different payouts at different rates, which ultimately is going to allow us to save some tax money, save some money paying taxes because we're taxing it at a lesser rate than we are our salary per se. And so that's the quick, fast, brief overview of S corporation designation. Again, you don't need to know all the details and all the nitty-gritty info about it. I just want to introduce it to you so that you're aware of it when you see it especially as you jump into a new entrepreneurial venture and you start to consider, okay, how are we going to set this up? What are the advantages, disadvantages? But like I said, I'm not a tax professional. I'm not giving you tax advice. What I'm doing is introducing the topic, and then as you have more questions, seek your tax professionals, people around you that can provide you with more detail specific to your situation. Okay, so that's the S Corp designation. Again, questions on that, reach out, let me know. Otherwise, we're going to move on to limited liability companies and discuss why really most of the time they're the best way, best option. Okay, so you've probably heard of limited liability companies or LLCs, and they're very popular today. Now, why are they so popular today as far as setting up a business entity for your business? It's because they're kind of a hybrid form that has all the benefits of a corporation and all the benefits of a partnership all mixed into one, okay? First and foremost, there's limited liability for the owners, which is huge, right? That means we're going to separate your personal assets, the things you personally own, from the business. So if, heaven forbid, I hurt somebody in my business, some damage happens to them, and they come to sue me, they couldn't come after my personal car or my personal bank account or my personal home because I've separated those assets by setting up a legal structure like an LLC to protect myself in that scenario. So yeah, they could come after anything the business owns or the business holds, but they couldn't come after me personally and attack any of my personal assets to be made whole for any damage that they've incurred. Okay. Other benefit, income tax at the personal level. It's really not a benefit. It doesn't save you on taxes as an LLC. It's just a little more straightforward than taxation on the corporate level, the corporation level, which I mentioned before. But again, I also mentioned with the S corporation designation, you could make an S corp designation even with an LLC so that you could save on taxes after making that designation if the scenario is right, the facts are right, and that works well for you. And that's when I tell you, go talk to a tax professional, somebody that can provide you specific advice for your specific situation, okay? Then finally, owners are only liable for their own personal actions and not the actions of other owners. Now, if you remember in the partnership, the general partners were liable for each other's actions regardless, right? Here, you're only going to be liable for your own personal actions, not the actions of the other owners of the LLC, which again, even separates you further from potential liability, potential issues, which is just another layer of protection that comes with setting up an LLC, okay? So again, LLCs are set up most frequently. When I practiced law actively a few years ago, this was certainly the most common type of legal entity we set up. And most states and Utah make it very easy to set up LLCs. And if you guys ever wanted to set up an LLC, you wanted to set up your entity for your business and you had questions about how to do that, always feel free to reach out to me individually. Be happy to help walk you through that and make sure we get it set up the right way. Because like I said, it's something I've done many times. And so I'm pretty comfortable and familiar with that. So those are our entities, the proprietorship, the partnership, there's variations of that, corporation, and an LLC. And there's even some designations that can happen in the corporation and the LLC. So what we're going to do next is on the next slide, we're going to move to a little exercise, and I'll go through the kind of the scenario, and then I want you to pause the video and be able to formulate an answer for me related to the scenario I give you, just so that we can help practice and remember some of the attributes that come with the entities that we've talked about. Okay, so here's our exercise to help us drive home all of those things we just learned about different legal entities. So I'm just going to read this to you, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit, okay? So Scott and Craig are brothers who want to start a software company for mining companies, okay? Software for mining companies. They both have considerable experience working in the mining industry and both want to be involved in the business, including daily safety monitoring of the software. They come to you seeking advice about forming their business, and they're particularly concerned about their potential liabilities and their exit strategy when the company explodes. See what I did there? So what I mean by exit strategy is when it's time for them and they want to be done with the business, they want to sell it or they want to move on, what is the exit strategy and which entity gives them the easiest exit strategy moving forward? So what business forms would you recommend to them? Why would you recommend that particular form? What are the advantages and disadvantages of that particular form? And then explain what protections the business form would offer them as it relates to potential liabilities. Okay, so pause your video and think to yourself. You can write it down. You can talk it out loud with a roommate or a spouse or whoever it is, and say, okay, of the entities we've talked about, proprietorship, partnership, corporation, or LLC, which one would be best for Scott and Craig if their two main concerns are potential liabilities and exit strategy? Okay, and when I say exit strategy, think transferability. So when we talked about the other entities, we talked about, is ownership easily transferable? Can it be passed along easily or not? That's really what we're alluding to when we talk about an exit strategy. Okay, so liability and exit strategy, or can things be transferred in the business? So which one would be best? Ready, set, go, and pause. And I'll move on to the next slide. We'll talk just briefly about this before we jump into intellectual property and see how you did. Okay, so at this point, you should have just taken care of the activity about Scott and Craig, their mining software. And most of the answers I usually get is either corporation or LLC. Again, both of those have good exit strategies. Both of those have pretty good liability protection. And then the details in between to argue for one or the other is just kind of up to you how you structure that, how you look at the scenario and what you think might be best. A partnership or a proprietorship is not probably a good option for Scott and Craig in that scenario, just FYI. But the corporation and the LLC both have good options for them, especially if they're worried about limiting liability and transferring or selling the company once they're done. So that's that. Let's move on to intellectual property. Talk about what it is, different types of intellectual property, and why it's important when we're starting businesses. Intellectual property, I mean, think of patents, copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets, etc. Okay. Now, why do people have those? Is because usually it gives them some sort of competitive advantage in their business. If I have a patent, that means I'm protecting my creation, my invention from being replicated or recreated in the world. And so it gives me a competitive advantage because I'm the only one that can sell that for a number of years. Also, venture capitalists or investors, they love to see intellectual property rights because, again, it gives a competitive advantage to that business, right? So the investors feel more assured in investing in that business because they know they have some kind of leg up on competitors. Now, some of the disadvantages of the intellectual property is it can take a long time to get them, like a patent can take a long time. And they can be very expensive to acquire sometimes as well, depending on who you use and what you need. And then even with protection, to actually enforce your intellectual property rights, you're usually spending money anyways to hire an attorney or to enforce the right in some way, shape, or form. And so it can be costly all around, even after you secure those protections. So that's a brief introduction to intellectual property. Let's jump into the next slide and we'll start to talk about some of the types, both contractually and things like patents and trade secrets, etc., and how they're different and why a company might want to use them.
Okay, so let's first talk about some different types of agreements, contract clauses that can be included as part of under this umbrella of intellectual property. First, non-disclosure agreements. This is a contract to keep information confidential. And what I mean by that is maybe you're going to engage with a company about selling your service or they're selling their service to you, but they don't want you to disclose some of the inner workings of their operation to other competitors. And so they say, hey, sign this non-disclosure agreement so that you can keep our information confidential, so that we can maintain a competitive advantage in terms of the way we run and operate our business. Okay, so that's a non-disclosure agreement. A non-compete clause. If you've signed an employee contract, you've probably signed one with a non-compete clause in it that says you can't go out and set up a competing business for a period of 2 years or within an hour of this geographical location. However they describe it, that's what I mean when we say a non-compete clause. They don't want you to go and create a business that's going to directly compete with them after you've worked for them. Now, these are hard to enforce, and especially in Utah, they're difficult to do, and depending on what niche you're in, can be harder or easier. But they are usually included in contracts to try and at least provide some sort of protection in that regard. Trade secrets. They're not granted by the government, but you have to take steps to ensure that your secrets are protected. A trade secret, it's somewhat like a patent, except there's not the kind of requirements that a patent has to enforce a trade secret or to gain protection for a trade secret. But some of the credentials, some of the requirements of a trade secret so that there is protection is that only a few people can know the secret, and everyone with access to the secret has to sign a non-disclosure agreement saying that they won't disclose the trade secret to anyone else. And then you all obviously have to take steps to protect it, like a non-disclosure agreement, or you lock it up in a vault, like a Coca-Cola recipe, right? They're going to lock it up in a really special place, only a few people know about it, and it's not shared with anybody else, so that if for whatever reason somebody disclosed it to somebody, then they could enforce that protection with the court by showing the steps that they took to protect that trade secret. Okay. So those are a few introductory topics to intellectual property. And again, not that you need to know all the nitty-gritty details about each one of those things. I just want to give you an introduction to some of those things that fall under this intellectual property umbrella. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one.
Okay, let's talk about patents. Patents are probably the most popular type of intellectual property we talk about, just because they're discussed in the news a lot, especially with lawsuits between big companies. And so let's go through that. Now, you can't file a patent on just an idea, only a finished product, meaning you have to have it fully fleshed out. Now, do you have to be mass producing it and selling it to file for protection? No, you can do it way before that, but it does need to be a fully fleshed out product, not just hey, I have this idea, I'm going to file protection for the idea itself. Okay, so your patent can be based on one of four types. There's a utility patent, a design patent, plant patent, and a business patent. A utility patent is typically the most popular one that we hear about, like in the news. Probably that and the design patent is the one we hear most often about. A utility patent is really I've created a new product that can be used for new things or new ways, and it's like a new invention, right? These are the really popular ones where people say, oh yeah, he created this thing and filed a patent for it and made a bunch of money licensing his patent or selling his patent to people because it was a brand new, never seen, never used invention. And that's this idea of utility. And it could include mechanical, chemical, electrical, or general inventions, but it's really typically a new invention, something novel, something new. Okay. A design patent protects the ornamental design of the product. And you'll see, I'm going to give you a link to a website where you can read about the Apple versus Samsung patent lawsuit, and that was specifically for design. It was actually about Apple's rounded curves on their phone, and they were suing Samsung, saying that Samsung had ripped off the rounded curve design from their phone, and that they were due damages for Samsung ripping that off. And so that's this idea of protecting the design of the product, the way it looks, feels, etc. Plant modifications, again, that's just we live in kind of an ag area here in Cedar City, and plant modifications are when we create hybrid crops or drought-resistant crops or plants that can do certain things that maybe natural plants couldn't, and so we make modifications through science to do that, and so these are protections that we can file for under a plant patent itself. And then business patents, these are new ways of running a business or improving a process, and so if you come up with some incredible way to distribute product or manufacture a product or run the business in a really efficient way and you want to protect that because it gives you an advantage over competitors, that's a patent you can file for as a business patent. But again, just much less prevalent than your utility and your design patents. There's actually quite a few plant patents out there in the world. It's a big business, ag is, and so there's a lot of that too, but we hear more about the utility and the design patents generally. So those are the four different types of patents. I'm going to do a few more slides on patents, just so that we really drill that home, and then we'll move on to the other parts of intellectual property protection. Okay, so let's talk about how we actually get a patent. What's the process? So you have to file a patent with the government to actually secure patent protection, okay? Now, in the application, you have to describe the product in full detail with enough drawings that a professional in the same industry would be able to recreate the product if they needed to. And you have to describe the ways that your product will be used. And if you try to hide the main use from the patent listing and just describe secondary uses, it could invalidate the patent. So you have to describe all the different types of uses, especially the primary use of the product or patent that you've created. And this is just part of the application process, some of the details you have to include when filing. Now, do I recommend people file their own patent? Usually no. It can be very complicated, very difficult, and that's why they have patent attorneys that specifically do this work day in and day out They know how to search databases. They know how to file patents the appropriate way so that you can have the, the, the appropriate protection when a patent is filed and issued, granted by the government. So that's kind of the process with the application. Okay, let's talk about why patents are rejected when you actually file the application and they get rejected. Let's look at some of the reasons that might happen. Now, again, do I advise people to do it on their own? Not usually, but it's good to be aware of this so that as you put together a product, you have something that you think, hey, maybe we need to patent this, you can understand some of these concepts related to it. First one, the product must be useful. Just because something is new doesn't make it eligible for patent protection. It has to have some sort of utility, some sort of use that would cause the government, the patent office, to provide protection for that particular use. Second, it needs to be novel. Basically, it just needs to be new, right? There's going to be a search of prior patents when an application is submitted, and to see if there's anything similar. And if there's something similar, then you can't be offered protection, right? If it's obvious to everyone, then it's not going to be patentable. Meaning, if everyone knew about it, everyone understands how it works or how it operates, and they could recreate it themselves without this patent, then you can't patent it. And so you got to make sure that there is some, it's novel in some way, shape, or form, new in some way, shape, or form that people aren't aware of, or don't understand, or know about. And then finally, the filing has to be timely. That means you have to file within 1 year of the product's introduction to the market. Now, a lot of people ask, well, what does it mean, product's introduction to the market? An initial advertisement or description in the media counts as an introduction to the market, not an actual sell. So you don't actually have to sell the thing. It could just be that you're introducing it to the market, you're advertising it in some way, shape, or form. Then you have a year from that time to actually file for the patent protection. So you have to make sure you hit all those things in the application. Otherwise, you're not going to have the protection you're looking for when actually filing for the patent. Okay, so this is the link to the article I mentioned before, Apple versus Samsung. This is a great article just describing the patent lawsuit that Apple engaged in with Samsung, all related to the design of their phone, the rounded corners of the phone. Apple stating that Samsung had ripped that off. At one point, the court had awarded Apple over $1 billion in damages for Samsung ripping that off, and then it was later reduced to 500 million or something like that. But significant amounts of money for something which seems as simple as rounded corners on a phone and the way they design it. But just goes to show you that there's a lot of money in the patent world, especially when big businesses are competing against each other like this and lawsuits take place. And so when I say venture capitalists and investors like to see intellectual property and especially patents filed and in place for a business, this is why, because it offers them a lot of power, a lot of capability to protect what it is they design and sell to people, and then also try to enforce that through the courts. Okay, let's talk about trademarks. And there are different types of trademarks. What we think of most often when we think of trademark is a company's logo, for example, right? Like the big McDonald's arches, they trademark that logo, right? But really what they are is just the right to protect a business's ability to differentiate their product and service from someone else. Okay, so this is how do we make sure we can protect the differentiation of our product, our brand, our business from a competitor or from somebody else. So trademarks, the first one, this can cover names, logos, graphic design of products. It can also include shapes, colors, odor, sounds of products, etc. That's all falls under that trademark category. Service marks are a protection for a company offering services like an accounting firm or an HVAC firm or whatever it is. They have marks that indicate they're offering a certain service, and they protect those to ensure that that industry, that niche, can be protected in some way, shape, or form. And then there's collective marks. These cover like memberships in private groups like fraternities or clubs or Masons or things like that, where we see special signs or symbols that indicate that you're part of a particular group. Those can also be protected under this trademark umbrella. And then certification marks cover labels that certify the quality of a product, like an energy efficient label or an EPPA label or whatever it might be, to indicate that they've met some kind of standard or quality with the product, and it's usually approved by some third-party authority group that provides that registration. So those are the different types of marks that can be included underneath this trademark umbrella. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few pictures of actual trademarks, like names, logos, graphic design of the product or the logo itself. And I want you to kind of be the judge of whether or not they infringed on this company's trademark or not. Okay, so let's move on to the next ones. Okay, enforcing trademarks, we have 7-Eleven, which probably all of you at least have heard about, right? Slurpee heaven. 7-Eleven, and then we have this Super 7 store, and if I'm not mistaken, I think Super 7 was some kind of big discount wholesale store or something like that. So not exactly like a 7-Eleven, but you can see that their logo is very similar to 7-Eleven's. And so I want you to think to yourself, in this case, did the court say that Super 7 was infringing on 7-Eleven's or not? What do you think? Pause, pause, pause. Yeah, they actually said that Super 7 was infringing on 7-Eleven's logo and awarded damages to 7-Eleven and required Super 7 to change that logo in some way, shape, or form. So that's a good example. I'll show you the next one. Okay, this is for all my Honey Nut Cheerio fans out there. I love Cheerios, all flavors of Cheerios, but especially Honey Nut Cheerios. And when I found this picture, I was so appalled because the the Millville brand that you see here, the box essentially looks identical to Honey Nut Cheerios, except it just says Millville instead of whatever brand is Cheerios, I can't remember. And then it even says Honey Nut, and then instead of Cheerios, it just says Crispy Oats, right? But the box itself looks so similar, I'm surprised that they had these in the store, which you can see there on the store shelves. So I don't know that there was a case for this particular one, but I had to bring up the picture because I thought they were so similar, and I was surprised that they were actually being sold in the store with a box that looks so much like the Cheerios box. Okay, so I had mentioned the McDonald's logo when we first kind of jumped in this trademark section. And you can see here on the left the McDonald's logo, and on the right is a McDowell's logo. Now, McDowell's was actually some kind of construction company, if I'm not mistaken. And McDonald's saw that McDowell's had a logo similar to theirs, and so they actually brought this to the court, and they said, "Hey, McDowell's is infringing on our logo. It's, people aren't going to be able to differentiate between McDowell's and McDonald's." And I'm interested to know whether you think McDonald's won or McDowell's won. What do you think? Pause, pause, pause. In this one, McDonald's won. Despite the fact that McDowell's was a completely different type of company, a construction company, McDonald's won because they said there could be confusion. The court agreed with that, and so they awarded damages to McDonald's, and McDowell's had to change that, the logo. So you're thinking to yourself, well, it sounds like all these big companies are the ones winning these ones. Well, yeah, the high-profile ones, yes. A lot of times the big companies win because they have a lot of firepower to put behind it, and a lot of these are similar enough that the court can be persuaded to provide that protection. So I thought these were some good examples to help you understand what some of that protection might look like and how the courts have decided on some of these cases. So those are the examples. Now I'm going to finish with copyrights, and that'll be our last slide in this intellectual property lecture and in our final lecture, lecture 7 here. But again, if you have questions as we go through, reach out and let me know. We'll finish with copyrights, and then we'll finish up this lecture. Okay, so copyrights. What are copyrights? This is protection given to things like digital media, like movies, music, plays, could either be software coding or programs, obviously books, magazines, research articles. All these different things can be protected under this copyright umbrella, okay? Now with copyrights, you don't necessarily have to file for a copyright to have protection. You only have to put the little symbol on your work to establish your rights. Like you'll see people write a book or do a website or whatever it is, and they put the copyright 2021 or whatever it is. But if you do file with the Copyright Office, you can establish damages for improper use without having to establish that you were damaged in future hearings, which means if you file, it's just easier to move forward securing damages and securing protection if you filed for a copyright, but it's not absolutely necessary. If you don't, you're just going to have to go back and prove that you asked or showed that protection in the work that you did at the time that you did it. So again, I introduced all these topics as far as intellectual property goes, not to help you understand all the details related to it, but just to give you an introduction to this idea of legal entity structure, why that's important in a business, and then intellectual property rights, different kinds, and why those might be important in a business. So again, if you have more questions about it, or if you have specific questions about maybe a business you're trying to run or start up, and you've got these legal entity questions, come and talk to me. I'm happy to answer the questions. That's why I'm here, to interact with you students and help answer those questions. So that's our final lecture. That's the legal structures and entities and the intellectual property rights. And don't forget to do the quiz on this and your speaker series portion, as well as the final business challenge portion. So again, questions about the class in general, assignments, this lecture specifically, reach out, let me know. Otherwise, we will chat in discussion and get things wrapped up. Thanks.